Here she comes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Steed Mawson, and I'd like to warmly welcome you here to our second Pipeline Information Forum. These pipeline conversations are very important because they're time for us to gather ourselves together and continue on that learning curve as we learn more about the Kinder Morgan Northeast NEdirect pipeline and how that will be affecting us and our communities. This forum is co-sponsored by the Pelham Pipeline Awareness Outreach Subcommittee, as well as Dracut Pipeline Awareness, our good friends and neighbors just to the south of us across the border in Massachusetts. And so on behalf of all of them, I would like to thank you all for being here. Dr. Sam Smith, who is a former professor of animal sciences at the University of New Hampshire in the 1980s, once said, "A good democracy requires people who are well educated and well fed." And that's really important. So we have provided food for you in the back to make sure that you're well fed. But the statement that I just made goes far beyond what's on that back table. Being well fed is essential in a democracy so that we're healthy enough to stand up. Being educated is essential so that we can speak with truth, authenticity, and credibility. And in a complex problem like the Kinder Morgan pipeline, we need to make sure that we are careful and thoughtful in our learning so that we're accurate in the kind of decisions that we make, so that we can ultimately make the best decisions possible. So there are many of us who are standing up here today and who are continually being educated as we work to oppose this project. So I would like to introduce you to the many volunteers and the elected officials and organizations who are here. I would like you to meet, for example, our Pelham Pipeline Outreach Subcommittee, who have done so much work to bring this together. I would also like you to meet our good friends in Dracut, many of whom are still, I see them at the door, who are working here with us, and we will be working with them to further the kind of learning that we need to do across our state borders. I also want you to know and get to know and learn about the many, many other folks that are working hard as we learn again about the Pelham, not just Pelham, I'm saying all of the folks along the pipeline route. Folks from Hudson, Nashua, Litchfield, Londonderry, Mason, Merrimack, New Ipswich, Rindge, Temple, our representative from New Hampshire Plan, and our good friends from Northfield, Mass, who have arrived. So if all of you that are from other towns, would you stand up, please, just so that we can all look at each other? There you are. So many wonderful people working hard. Those of you that are from Pelham, please take a look at these folks, get to know these folks, because they're here to share information and to help all the work that we do get stronger. So thank you all very, very much. I'd also like you to meet our Shayna Casper, who has been kind enough to come all the way from Vermont from the Toxic Action Center. There she is. And I'd also like to thank our representatives who have come today. I'd like you to meet Sean Jasper, and Sean is in the front right here, who is our House Speaker, and also Jim McConnell, who's been a tireless supporter of all of us. Jim is right here in the front as well. I would also like to make sure that we, if we don't do it in person, but at least in spirit, thank our wonderful town officials here in Pelham that have been so kind and so supportive. Sue Snide is our official representative of the town today. Our elected officials would be here today, except that Jim Greenwood, who is the gentleman responsible for all of our media and auditory things here in town, his mom passed away, and this is the day of her funeral. So, if you would all, excuse me, spend a minute just thinking about the Greenwood family Jim has just been wonderful to us, and we're very sorry for the things that they're facing right now. So, having said that, I want to let you know that there are two goals when we're talking about standing up, and I certainly showed you a lot of people that are standing up in a whole variety of ways. But there are also the other issues of making sure that we're educated. So we have two goals. One is we want you to meet each other and get to know each other so that the work that we do gets better and better. We need to spread the word about this pipeline and the very complex issues that we face with it. The other thing is we want to make sure that our learning curve about this pipeline goes up and that we get stronger as we go along. So we're going to get ready to do that in this forum, and there are a couple of things that I'd like you to do before we begin. One is if you have cell phones, if you shut them off, that would be great. We love music, but it's always better to have music that's intentional instead of music that occurs out of our pockets. I did mine just a couple seconds ago. And I'd also like you to think about this, and that is that in a situation like this, there are many, many, many opinions, and we need to make sure that we leave plenty of room for all of those opinions. So we may not all agree about how to handle something. We may not even agree about whether we want this pipeline or not. So I'm going to ask you to look at your agenda, and on the back of it, it gives you some guidelines for how we would like to make sure that we keep ourselves in a good, open dialogue together. And as one of my good friends who was a master teacher used to say, if anybody misbehaves, I'm going to show you my teacher lips. But we have had wonderful conversations in our forum in the past, and I know we're going to do the same thing today. So I'm going to ask our volunteers. They've been stalwart in standing up here, so if we could all sit down. Thank you again for your wonderful, wonderful work. And what I'd like to do now is to get ready to introduce to another person that has been standing up, doing presentations for every month since October. And I'd like to introduce you to our good new friend, Dr. Curtis Nordgaard. Dr. Nordgaard is a pediatrician. He works in Dorchester, Massachusetts. He's originally from Minnesota, where he completed his medical school there. And then he moved to Boston to train in pediatrics at the Boston Medical Center and the Boston Children's Hospital. He has completed research training in psychology and biology as well, and has 10 peer-reviewed research studies in those fields to his name. He has currently been doing work looking at the environmental health field, including evaluation the health implications of frack gas infrastructure, as well as collecting data on outdoor air quality. When he and his family have free weekends, they often visit his in-laws here, who live just down the street from us, not far from Dracut. So I guess he's kind of a homeboy. So we welcome you home, Dr. Nordgaard, you and your family, and we're going to let you take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Should I use the microphone for sure, or only if people?
I think I'd use it. This hall, I think this hall sucks up air pretty easily, right? So use the microphone, yes? Use the microphone? Yep. I see heads going. So.
All right, very good. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. There are plenty of other things we could all be doing, and unfortunately we're faced with the task of learning about this project that would affect so many of our lives, and for some of us thinking about how we can stop something that we think would be detrimental to our families and the environment and community that we love. And it's been humbling for me to be here early for the poster sessions. Wonderful to meet Pelham residents, Dracut residents, elected officials, and leaders in the community on this issue. But also humbling for me to realize how much people here know locally about the unique aspects of this project in your own backyards. I have spoken a lot of times in different communities and learned a lot about pipelines in general and the health-related concerns. And I'll just ask for your understanding. I hope to contribute something helpful here today, and I also realizing that you all may know a lot of this already. So why don't we get started? I just want to share the things that I want to try and cover today in our short time together. The first is, for those of us who may or may not be familiar with the bigger picture of interstate gas pipelines, what is the basic anatomy of a gas pipeline, these large interstate pipelines? And then go into detail about the infrastructure that would be at the site of the pipeline or the compressor station in Dracut. Again, something that a lot of you may be familiar with already. And then we have to pause and at least acknowledge that there are some myths that are widely circulated, widely held by, they're spread by the companies that are involved with these projects. They are proposed by the groups that oversee our power supply. They're even, unfortunately, supported by some of our state officials, both elected officials and state agencies. And then the final thing that I'll talk about briefly during my presentation and more in one of the workshops afterwards is the question of monitoring, which my feeling is that compared to other places that I visited is something that residents in New Hampshire are very interested in. So I'd like to address that as well. So the first thing to talk about is just the big picture, the pipeline. And there's already, if you had a chance to come, I think there's a map, overall map of the pipeline here as well. But it starts in Pennsylvania. Over on the left, this blue section, and then it crosses into New York, and the other segment of the pipeline in purple through Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and back down to Dracut, very close to us here. And so to start with, there's the obvious, the pipeline. And these are just some easy-to-find pictures off the internet, but I think it's important to acknowledge what it takes to build one of these pipelines. The land gets cleared, the ground gets dug up, the pipe is laid, and there's a permanent easement that interrupts the habitat where the pipeline is built. In some cases, it may coincide with the energy transmission infrastructure, high tension power lines, but not always. Sometimes we have to clear new land. And then as you can see in this other picture on the lower right, unfortunately, fracked gas or natural gas, or as I'm trying to call it more these days, methane gas, is flammable, and pipelines do have incidents. And so this is a map of the United States with showing the locations of all of the safety incidents that got reported to one of the federal agencies overseeing pipelines. From 2010 to 2015, there were over 3,000 incidents, and those involved 369 injuries and unfortunately 78 deaths. So I bring this up simply to say that I'm not going to talk a lot about the pipeline itself, but it's not trivial. That's a very important issue, and I'd like to just acknowledge that with this slide. And along with the pipeline, there's a lot of infrastructure that's required to maintain the pipeline. And one of those things are pigging stations. And this is something that people have often brought up when I've gone out to meet with potentially affected communities, are pigging stations. And so what is a pigging station? You might think that we're talking about natural gas, or as I like to call it, methane gas. It turns out that this gas, on average, is about 95% methane, and that means 5% of something else. And that 5%, some of it might be naturally occurring radioactive material, because the gas that we would get in New England is coming from the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania that has high levels of radiation. It's also high in volatile organic compounds, and so the gas coming out of that part of the state is, several percent of it is volatile organic compounds. And so what you don't have this gas moving cleanly through a pipe, and if you look on the inside, you might picture it's going to be the stainless steel, bright pipe. It's actually coated with a black material, and that is the deposited material that, of all of those things coming out of the gas other than methane, because under the pipeline conditions, methane is not one of the things that would deposit, but radioactive materials like lead, polonium, radon, radium, those things could potentially break down and deposit along the lining of the pipeline. Volatile organic compounds can be easily found in a liquid or solid phase along the pipeline. And older pipelines, like the Algonquin pipeline in other parts of New England, do have PCBs associated with them. So this short list of associated compounds, these are things that we either know or people like regulatory agencies suspect to be associated with the lining of the pipeline. And it's really hard to find data on this because of all of the pipeline issues. You know, compressor stations get a lot of the relatively most attention. Other things like pigging stations are not as well understood. And so there are a couple of reports here and there, and that's where this material comes from. So a pigging station is a place on the pipeline where there's an inlet or an outlet, and something, what you can see here, there's this thing kind of sticking out of the pipeline. It's a giant squeegee, in effect, that gets put into the pipeline, and under very high pressure, it gets pushed through a segment of the pipeline, and along the way, it's cleaning these deposits from the lining of the pipeline, and those get pushed out ahead of this pig. And that's the black stuff you see pouring out of these pipelines. And that material, it potentially contains radioactive material, toxic material, cancer-causing material. But again, very poorly understood. This is not something that gets reported in a way that's easy to find. It's been very hard for me to find any information on it. So that's one thing that comes along with a pipeline, not just the pipe itself. There are other things, metering and regulating stations. I was having a conversation before the talk about how these can also be a site of blowdowns. And it's actually explicitly stated in Kinder Morgan's own paperwork that volatile organic compounds and methane can be released from metering and regulating stations. And what they are, I mean, this is a picture of one in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, it's at an industrial zone, so the large infrastructure in the background is not part of the station, but the smaller building and small pipeline yard are part of these stations. And they're used to regulate pressure, they're used for measuring different aspects of the gas, and they are also a site for venting pipelines. And so I just mentioned these in passing as part of the maintenance infrastructure of a pipeline, or the operational infrastructure. And these are all over New England right now. And so what we usually think about are other than the pipeline, are the compressor stations. And this is a generic picture from an aerial view of a compressor station in Pennsylvania. And the reason I like to show this picture is it gives us, if you're someone who hasn't spent a lot of time looking into this, it gives you a feel for what a compressor station is. I think of it as a mini version of a power plant, a small factory, a small piece of industrial infrastructure. There's always at least one main building, there's some amount of pipeline, and there are always storage tanks. And we'll talk more about some of those things, but this gives you at least some mental picture of what those might look like. And of course, this is very few compressor stations are electric driven, which is what Kinder Morgan would like to build in Drake. Most of them are gas fired, which is almost certainly the one we're looking at here. So now, those are the main ideas that I want to talk about for pipelines if people are not as familiar with them. So the basic anatomy of a pipeline. And now what I'd like to do is really go into detail about what might be at the Drake compressor station if it's approved and built. And then we'll continue on to those other topics. And again, this is something that most, if not all, of people in the audience are probably more familiar with than myself, but this is a satellite view of the area. There's this major swath. My pointer's not really working, but if you're able to see, there's a clearing where the high voltage or high tension power lines are coming through the area. And you can see where it crosses the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border. So if you start kind of in the middle, going up from there would be Pelham, and going south from the border, Dracut, obviously. And the red dot is the compressor station. If you went all the way down, especially if you zoomed in further, I just cut off the edge of Dracut where that contains the gas hub that I think people are probably familiar with, that a lot of pipelines converge in Dracut. And one of the things I'd like to address when we talk about the compressor station, again, this is my first time visiting the area. I've been in communication with some people from the area, but to what extent are people saying, well, this is just an electric compressor station, right? We don't have to worry about it. Look at people in other parts of the pipeline path that have to deal with a compressor station that would be fired by gas and release so much more pollution, and I'm not going to worry about it because it's electric. Well, I have a few things to share, and this is information I've referenced as many materials as I can for people to look up on their own later if that's helpful. There would be two compressors, 15,000 and 8,000 horsepower. But along with that, there are a lot of other things, and I think my references to other maintenance infrastructure shouldn't surprise you to see this. Blowdown valves, filtering and separating units, a discharge cooler, backup generator, auxiliary pipe systems, air compressor system, water heating system, a compressor and a valve building, a control building, a variable frequency drive building, a building for gas coolers. And now you can see where we're moving from, just think about like if you have a conversation on the street, like an electric compressor, what does that bring up in your mind? It could be something small sitting in the corner of this room just burning, like you plug it in the wall. Well, now we're getting more towards this idea that this is a small piece of industrial infrastructure. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. There are other things. Right? An electric power substation and transformer. Again, this I'm expecting is not new for anyone in the area, but 15,000 and 8,000 horsepower of compression, that requires a lot of electrical power. And that's part of why these are not built very often. It's very challenging to do that. And so it would require a power substation. And if a station were to be built away from high tension power lines, then you'd have to talk about putting in these very high voltage lines, but of course they've chosen to build it next to those lines, which at least reduces that aspect of it. But then there's something else very important that we'll also come back to in the near future, a condensate storage tank. And remember I said there are always tanks at these stations, and some of them are for storing fuel, but some of them are for storing something called condensate, which is that a lot of gas processing happens at compressor stations. The Dracut station, that wouldn't be a situation of there's just an electrical device sitting on a gas pipeline and the gas is just coming in and moving forward. It actually gets processed. And one of the things that happens is there are something like scrubbers or dehydrators that pull out the non-methane components of the gas. And what starts out to be a couple percentage in the gas ends up getting concentrated into these storage tanks as the gas gets processed. And those get stored in tanks on site, and sometimes those are venting those toxic chemicals into the air. Mainline valve with blow-off assembly. Again, there's reference to like blowing things off. Bidirectional pigging traps. We already talked about that. What are pigging traps? And these last few items, a stormwater retention pond, parking, outdoor storage, those I think are really important to bring up because, again, if you look at the site where they would build this station, what's there right now is a bunch of trees. There's some forest there, and outside of that, nearby are some homes. So we're going to clear this forest and build this industrial infrastructure that includes, you can see, you've got all these buildings, stormwater pond, parking, outdoor storage. So it's really going to change the character of that community, and that is it's an important point to bring up. So again, just to help us have a mental model or a picture of what we're talking about, a compressor is actually, for these pipelines, is actually two components. There is something that generates the force, and most of the time that is burning gas to generate the force. But in the case of an electrical station, it's a driver, and so this is the thing that's powered by electricity. So the unit that's in the top left corner is similar to the gas-fired unit that would go into other stations on this pipeline. The one on the bottom right is an electric version. And once those units generate the power, that power gets transferred to a compressor, which is just this kind of generic-looking industrial piece of equipment. And when you put them together in a room, one of those buildings, it might look something like this. And from the outside, what you're looking at, again, like I said, this is like a small factory or piece of industrial infrastructure, and the power substation would have to be part of that. And again, if thinking a little bit broader than just talking about a compressor station, this electric station, it has to, if you start on the left of this figure, you start with an electric compressor. That's actually, the power is coming from a transformer and a substation and the transmission lines, and that's obviously coming from a power plant. And where is the electricity for this station in Drake going to come from? Is it going to come from the nuclear plant, the Vermont Yankee? Is it going to come from a coal-burning plant in New Hampshire? Is it going to come from a fracked gas power plant that would be built in Salem? Right? So you could see this becomes sort of circular. We're building the fracked gas power plant to generate the electricity to send to the compressor so that we can send the gas onto the power plant. Or we're just going to use this electric, we're going to burn the coal in some other part of the state near someone else, and we'll be the ones that have the electric compressor station. So it's not a matter of the electric station solves problems, it just transfers them somewhere else. And I should just point out, these slides are from an industry presentation that's available online, but I thought they did a good job of showing some points here, and this statement here at the bottom, true carbon footprint, question, question, question. That was actually part of the presenters, the industry presenters slide. No, I didn't put that in myself, but an interesting point. So, one thing, I'm a pediatrician. I didn't say much about that, but obviously I have an interest in environmental health and children's health, community health, and so we have to talk about air emissions, air pollution. And again, one might say, well, this is not releasing the dozens and dozens of tons of toxic air pollution that would come with one of these other stations, like our neighbors down the road in Temple and New Ipswich, or Northfield, Massachusetts, and so on. But again, if we look at the details of what's at one of these stations, well, I think we can have a conversation about, is this really, should we be concerned or not? So what I'm showing here, I don't want to get into the numbers, but I want to make a couple points. This is, again, from Kinder Morgan's final filing in November, and these are numbers for the amount of pollution they expect to come from an emergency backup engine. So again, there's going to be an emergency backup engine. There's going to be a heating unit, which will produce, there's another table just like this for that unit. And what this table is showing is some of the major air pollutants like nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, but it's also listing in detail the hazardous air pollutants that would be coming from this backup engine, right? Because if the power supply goes out, they need to have a way to continue generating compression in the pipeline. So all of these have backup generators, and they always say, well, we're going to estimate like it's going to be operating a certain number of hours a year when the power supply is unreliable or inadequate. And if you look closely, if you're able to see, some of these things are familiar names to us probably, like benzene. We've been hearing about that with the Porter Ranch leak in California, xylene, toluene. But then the other things, tetrachloroethane. What do we think about that? I don't know, but it is it's a hazardous air pollutant. Chlorobenzene, 1,3-butadiene. These things are in this list because they're all toxic, and some of them, if not all of them, cause cancer. And so this is what Kinder Morgan is saying in their paperwork. Yep, we just want to let you know we're going to be releasing this stuff as well. And that's where I think a lot of people have locally had concerns, even though the station would be in Drake, but what does that mean for not only people in Drake, but Pelham, other places nearby? And I am going to make some comments about the numbers after I wrap up this section of the talk, so I'll come back to that. And the other thing that always comes up, blowdowns, right? It's one of the things that I think comes up pretty quickly when people are thinking about compressor stations. So for all different sections of the pipeline, like I said, metering and regulating stations, mainline valves, compressor stations, they're all venting gas. There are fluctuations in pressure. They have to release pressure. Sometimes they depressurize the system for maintenance. And so another part of their application is saying, well, how much pollution are we going to be releasing during these blowdown events? And so some of you, you can find it if you sort through the hundreds of pages. Some of you may have already seen this, or maybe knowledge among your working groups, that they're saying, well, we're proposing or estimating that there would be 775 blowdowns a year. And then from here, starting with this box in red, they work through some calculations to say, well, if we're starting with this 75, right, and where do they get that from? Well, I think that's from their experience operating pipelines. And is it going to be 75? Is it going to be 100, 150, 50? We don't know, because this is just what they're putting in their application. And who is the industry person to hold them to task and say, no, that's actually not the correct number? Who here can do that, right? We have to take their word for it. And so what these calculations are doing, as we'll kind of walk through some of them, is trying to address the question, well, are the blowdowns going to have an effect on climate change? And are they going to have an effect on hazardous air pollutants, all right? And so you can see, like for starters, I just am going to start with the assumption that we all agree climate change is real, and the companies, gas pipelines themselves, companies themselves, they have to address this in their applications. So we're having a conversation about it. And so this line here that I boxed in red, on the left, 2,000 plus tons of CO2e, that's carbon dioxide equivalents. That's kind of like putting everything into the same currency, like everything is sold in US dollars. And so they're coming up with a number that says, well, from our blowdowns, they're going to affect the climate in such a way. There'll be 2,000 or so tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. But if you look all the way on the right side of that equation, there's a number. They say, well, this many tons of methane a year and times 25 CO2 equivalents per CH4. And what is this 25, right? Where did that come from? That 25 came from, if you look in their documents, that 25 came from a report by the International Panel on Climate Change, which is this huge United Nations body that does a lot of work on international climate change. And the reason they chose the 25 is because that is about the smallest number you can get from a reputable source on estimating how powerful methane is in affecting climate change compared to carbon dioxide, right? So they're looking at 100 years from now, and they're saying the gas that we're blowing off from our compressor today, 100 years down the road, it will be 25 times as intense at driving climate change as carbon dioxide. And let me tell you, 100 years from now, if we keep going down the road we're on, we're going to lose sections of Boston to water, like flooding. All right? So I don't think that's an appropriate time frame to be looking at. And there are a lot of other people who feel the same way. And if you look at a 10 to 20-year time frame, right, and 20 years is a more appropriate time frame for the lifespan of these projects, whether you're talking about a gas power plant or a pipeline, or the rate of climate change, which is accelerating, and we're seeing that every year now. 10 or 20 years, it's going to be even worse. And in a 10 to 20-year time frame, methane is really more likely 4 times as intense at driving climate change as what the calculations they're using in their paperwork. And so really, the blowdown events solely from that one compressor station, if we assume the frequency that they're telling us, the frequency of events, would really be more like 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year just from blowing down the methane, all right? That's nothing else. That's not taking into account anything else from this entire massive project. 8,000 tons a year. So we're going to come back to that issue. And this is just a brief aside. Where's the information coming from, I think, is something a lot of people wonder. Where are they coming up with the toxic pollutants from their gas? Well, there's this representative gas. They got these numbers from, they even did say this in their own filing. These are from a project they built in Kentucky some number of years ago. This is not the composition of gas from the Marcellus Shale that we would be getting here. So we really don't know what the volatile organic compound, the hazardous air pollutant content of the gas coming from the Marcellus Shale to our region of New England. We don't really know what that is. They may know. They're probably testing it, but that's not what they're using in their documents. And so I want to come back to, talked about the station, the engines, the pollution coming from those different things like the backup generator or backup engine. And I want to come back to this idea of the storage tanks where they could be storing this condensate. And this is a picture from a study that was done in Texas where the investigators went out to all different kinds of fracking sites, including compressor stations. And this is a picture taken with an infrared camera of the vent from a condensate storage tank. All right, so this is the same kind of tank that would be at the Drake site. And everything else about the context is a lot different. So I can't say for certain how this would translate into our situation here. But when those research investigators took this picture with an infrared camera, they saw this vent of gas coming off of the condensate tank, all right? You couldn't see that without the use of this camera. So if you're not actually measuring what's happening, you really will have very little idea about what's going on with these sites. And so when they saw like a condensate tank, a compressor, anything venting gas or releasing gas, they took air sample measurements. And when they sampled the air from the point of view of where this picture was taken, the amount of benzene in the air was 1,100 parts per billion. So I can tell you that's a lot. But what does that mean in real terms? Well, we have to keep in mind benzene is toxic. It's also known to cause cancer. It causes leukemia. And that's why it's one of the things that comes up a lot, again, with something like the Porter Ranch gas leak. Benzene, it's very important for human health. And that's because levels of benzene as low as 0.14 parts per billion start to increase the risk of cancer. And again, in the case of leukemia, is mostly leukemia, or in the case of benzene, is mostly leukemia. So that's 0.14 parts per billion increases cancer risks. And it's toxic at concentrations of 3 to 9 parts per billion. And what it does, it does something that's called suppresses the bone marrow. That's how a medical person might talk about it. And the bone marrow is where our body produces most of our red and white blood cells. And so if that function is suppressed, you don't have enough red blood cells, that's anemia. You don't have enough white blood cells. Again, the medical terms, I might call that lymphopenia, leukopenia, but what does that mean in real terms? It means, those are the cells your body needs to fight infection. And so that's one of the toxic effects of benzene, is it reduces the number of cells you need to fight infections. And then it gets into the nervous system, causes headaches, other problems. All right, and the other thing, benzene is not just relevant for the condensate tanks, again, because if it's in the gas, it's going to be in all different parts of the complex. So I just want to bring up this one table from a great study I always reference, where researchers partnered with community members to take air samples near different gas infrastructure sites. And one of these, I usually don't make a big deal out of it, but we have time to talk about it today. I want to acknowledge that when community members took air samples near a pigging station, 270 meters away from a pig launch site, they measured benzene at this 1.79 parts per billion, which maybe that at that one time was a little under the toxic threshold, but it was clearly more than 10 times above the concentration of benzene that increases cancer risks. And so really these are probably about the best data we have about pigging stations, which is one of the great challenges to understand what are the potential risks to our health. We don't even know because we don't even have the data yet. But what we do know about and what the data that we do have are very concerning to myself as a health professional, and that's part of why I visit Pelham and other places to talk about this. And so I want to summarize some of the comments about emissions and health. And one of the points I want to make is that the projections that I went through here really fairly briefly Those are what the company anticipates based on manufacturer specifications and whatnot about how much pollution would be released under ideal operating conditions. And so as components age, whether that's valves, pipelines, backup engines, et cetera, or they're not maintained properly, or there are fluctuations in temperature that they didn't account for, these things will operate at different efficiency. And we won't know down the road how much pollution is coming out of these things unless it's measured. The other thing I'd point out, part of why I didn't go into great detail to talk about that table of all of the different air pollutants is because that table simply listed pounds or tons per year. And that information is only helpful for a regulator. All right? So if you're a state regulator, you might look at that and say, well, that's lower than my threshold of concern, so I'm not going to worry about it anymore. You're all done, Kinder Morgan, you don't have to worry about it. But what we need to know to have a discussion about health is a concentration, all right? So if you tell me something is going to release a pound of benzene, that tells me nothing in terms of how it could affect health, except I know benzene is bad. What you need to do is show me either by measuring it in the air or by doing calculations like some kind of forecasting or modeling, and show how the amount that you're releasing will be spread out in the air to end up with a concentration, because everything that's done in terms of investigating the health impacts is done by looking at concentrations. So those numbers, whatever they are, you know, they seem small, okay? That's fine, but that tells us nothing about health. And whether it's small or not, it's not going to give us the information we need. So just like I was saying for picking stations, there's a real lack of the knowledge that we need to really evaluate the health concerns, other than to say that there are going to be toxic and cancer-causing chemicals coming out of the station, which for me, again, that's enough to make me concerned. A couple other points. Again, that list of hazardous air pollutants, we might be able to go back to any one of them and say, oh yeah, like benzene, this is the cutoff for causing cancer, this is the cutoff for toxicity. What if you have benzene and formaldehyde together? Do you just add those numbers up, or do they multiply so that you have 2, 3, 8, 10 of them together? Now, are they more toxic than they would be individually? That we don't know. And that really is a broader scientific question that simply we just have a real limit in our knowledge at this time. And the last thing I want to bring up is, what is your own individual assessment of health risk, right? And this is what I'm getting at with, what is my level of concern as a healthcare provider, somebody who cares about the health of children, protecting communities, and community health. And most of us here either live near the Drake station, Drake, Pelham, or other parts of the state. And what is your personal threshold of concern? If the state tells you, you don't have to worry about the 1,3-butadiene because it's a small number, and that's below my threshold limit, do you feel satisfied with that? Are your concerns addressed, right? Because state agencies and are going to have federal agencies, and there are sometimes even local regulatory concerns. They're all going to be different, right? So you have your own threshold of concern as an individual and a family. The state has their own, and Kinder Morgan has their own, right? And well, let me tell you, Kinder Morgan, I'm assuming they don't think any of this is going to be a problem, right? We're going to make a lot of money, and you're all going to be fine. Don't worry about it. And so I side, I think, clearly with the families. I am very concerned about the health effects. Okay, so I want to move on and just make a reference to something else that doesn't come up a lot, which is noise. People who might have to deal with one of these projects in their neighborhood are concerned about the noise. I just put up noise standards. We don't have to go into detail, but the FERC, the federal agency that approves pipelines, they say they follow the EPA standard of 55 decibels. Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has their own standards that have to do with how much a project would increase noise at a home or the property limit. Unfortunately, Drake doesn't have any local regulations. Other towns do, like in Rhode Island, for example. Other companies have to abide by town sound limits. And in fact, this is what they've done, Kinder Morgan had done by the time of their filing to address sound. So what they've actually said, the first paragraph, if you read through it, they say the sound levels due to venting are like blowdowns are not expected to exceed this 10 decibel threshold that the state of Massachusetts has set. And but what they do say is the station contribution to sound levels, kind of on a more overall basis, at the property line, so at the edge of the station, would range from an additional 38 to 65. That's the contribution of the station. And then what they say in the next paragraph, I think, is very telling. And in the process of sorting through all of these documents, bring up a good point, similar to points that other people have brought up. The predicted sound level in the second paragraph is not likely to meet the limit at the station property line. They just said they're going to exceed it, all right? So we're in the process of evaluating mitigation and sound attenuation devices. We'll continue to do so following submittal of the Massachusetts DEP application to attempt to comply with the property line standard, all right? If we said nothing, if we looked at none of this and said nothing, here they're already admitting that we're going to try and we're looking at it. We'll do what we can after we submit the applications. Okay, we'll see what we can do. If nobody looks at this, can you imagine what they would do? This is with people all over New England looking at this project and raising concerns. So I think it's just, as we talk about what are we doing to protect ourselves, important to point out yet another issue where I have no confidence, I do not trust what's being done. I have a background in science and medicine. I want to see numbers. I want to see data. And so far, I don't see a lot in terms of reassuring data. So we've talked about these first 2 points, and I want to come back to some of the myths that I hear in New England. One of those is that, well, yeah, I'm sorry that we have to build a pipeline through your neighborhood, but it's to support a clean natural gas power plant, right? And this is not even to get into the issue of the gas going out of the country, but there are clearly a lot of gas-fired power plants that are in different phases of planning and construction in New York and New England. So these numbers are from a proposal for a plant in Rhode Island, and it would burn both fracked gas or methane and diesel. And I put up this table simply to point out the fact that this is not clean. All right, so if you look at nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter are 4 of the 6 EPA criterion pollutants. And if you add that up, it's 750 tons a year. This company is saying we want to release up to this much, 750 tons a year. All right, can you imagine living near that? 750 tons of, they're regulated because they're toxic, right? This is very important. So it's not clean. Now, I might agree with you if you said, well, yes, but if I were to build the exact same coal plant right next to it instead, would it release more nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, particulate matter? Yeah, most of the time I would say, sure. If I had to choose between one of those two, I would probably choose the frack gas plant, but maybe not. So look at this. Carbon dioxide, these frack gas plants, they're great for climate change, right? This is the bridge. This is what we were hearing. The frack gas is going to be our bridge for the U.S. to generate our own power, our own fuel, and this is going to get us out of coal and transition to renewables, and it's going to be a clean alternative to coal. 3.6 million tons of carbon dioxide. This is not pounds, this is tons. 3.6 million tons from one gas power plant, and it gets worse from there. I want to talk about a couple of issues that are brought up by a professor at Cornell, Dr. Howarth. The first is based on, it's well summarized in this figure here. You see there are 2 bars. One is for natural gas or methane. The other is for coal. If you look at the y-axis, what are those bars measuring? They're looking at what is the effect on climate per unit of electricity produced by burning methane or by burning coal. So you see carbon dioxide equivalents per megajoule of electricity. But really it's looking at how much are you driving climate change by burning gas versus burning coal. Now go back and look at the yellow bars. That is the amount of greenhouse effect or climate change effect in terms of carbon dioxide. And you can see natural gas, if you just looked at yellow, the yellow natural gas is a lot lower than coal. Right? And this is the story we've been sold for a long time, right? The natural gas is a better alternative to coal. It's going to release a lot less carbon dioxide, right? That's better for climate change. It's cleaner. Why wouldn't you want this? It's our homegrown energy supply. But the important thing about what Dr. Howarth and other people are doing is looking at the bigger picture, the entire life cycle of methane production. And that includes fracking, the pipelines, the gas plants, the distribution lines, right? Have you heard about the studies documenting pipeline leaks in Boston and Washington, D.C.? If you look at studies that have been done, it's somewhere on the order of 2 to 3% of the methane that's produced gets released into the atmosphere, right? And that shouldn't be a surprise, right? We just talked about blowdowns. And every valve, every little joint in these pipelines can and do leak. And that's not even talking about what happens at the fracking fields. So if you look at the entire life cycle of coal and natural gas, now look at this, the yellow and the red, it's actually higher for natural gas than it is for coal. And that should lead you to question, well, is this really better for climate change than burning coal? And just to give you a little bit different sense of that, if we go back and look at the pipeline now, they do have their own estimates, like I was walking you through for blowdowns. They did the same thing for the entire project, and you can add those numbers up. It comes out to 1.59 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents to build and operate it for 1 year. So that's incorporating construction and 1 year of operation. And that's using their 25 factor for methane, which is not valid, right? That's looking at 100 years from now, how is this thing going to affect climate change, right? It's not relevant for our children and our grandchildren. We need to know the higher number, but we'll go with that for now. And you're probably all, maybe not all of you, some of you may be aware that there's a lot of background conversation about this pipeline supporting a frack gas power plant potentially to replace Vermont Yankee, right? In the western part of the state, I get contacted by people who are very concerned about the discussions that this pipeline is potentially going to support a frack gas power plant. And having spoken with elected officials and state energy policy officials in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, they're in agreement with ISO New England that manages the electricity grid in New England, and they're all on board with the idea that these frack gas plants are going to get us through until we can get the renewables online. But so what I'm doing here is, the point to bring that up is, if we want to think about the climate change effect of these pipelines, there's the building it, there's the operating it, there's a power plant that's going to come with it, including other power plants or burning it in other countries or in our homes. But if we just look at those two sources that were easy to get numbers for, they add up to over 5 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. Again, that's a number that may not make a lot of sense, so the EPA has a system for converting those tons of carbon dioxide equivalents to how many cars does that add up to? How many motor vehicles? So the amount of climate change effect from this pipeline and a power plant that would come with it could be on the order of over 1 million vehicles a year, right? So, how many people live in New Hampshire, right? Think about practically a car for every person in New Hampshire just to build, operate this pipeline and use it to make electricity. So all of that to say, this is quoting again Dr. Howarth. Methane, he's quoting saying the IPCC, this International Panel on Climate Change, says methane emissions are, if we're looking at this 10-year time frame, which I would argue is very relevant for climate change, for our children's future, methane emissions are more important slightly than carbon dioxide emissions for driving the current rate of global warming. So we have to move beyond just talking about coal, and we have to talk about how is all of the things that make burning fracked gas or methane for electricity production a big problem. And it's, part of why I bring this up is because these are kind of myths I feel we're being sold, and it's important to challenge those with data. But the other thing is to point out that, you may be, if you were a landowner whose land would be affected by this pipeline, you may be walking through here looking at the maps and feeling like this is a very local issue, and it certainly is. But I think it's also important to point out that there are incredible implications of what's happening with your property. This would affect so many people and all of our children's future. So very important points I I know I'm a health professional and people want to hear about health, but I think that we have to talk about those things as well. And the last thing to talk about is monitoring, again, because this is something a lot of people have been interested in New Hampshire, I feel in particular. And what I want to point out is before we even talk about buying some kind of fancy equipment or paying for fancy testing, I want to introduce this idea of a citizen watchdog. And this is based on things that I've seen happening with pipelines around New England and New York and talking to state agencies. I want to introduce the idea that even without spending all this money to do the testing, you can already be doing the monitoring and acting as a watchdog for these projects. And the first point is trespassing. All right, has anyone here heard about cases where the Kinder Morgan survey contractors have been found trespassing, right? Anyone heard those stories? Okay, right. I mean, I've heard them from people along the pipeline route. I've heard it from people in Pennsylvania, other places. So document that, right? Take photos, take videos. You know, it's not easy. You have to. It's a little confrontational and go out and document this, but I think it's important to do. And that's part of your being a watchdog. That's already happening. We don't have to wait for it to get approved to start acting on that. Construction, all right? They say they're going to clear a certain amount of trees. It's clear that other companies in other places are clearing trees well beyond the area that was approved for clearing. They're going through and damaging wetlands that were not supposed to be affected. And it's very important, you know, again, if we're talking about what kind of monitoring can we do to protect ourselves in this area, documenting any of these violations, and then other things, again, down the road, if this were to be operational, odors, noise, environmental damage, I made some reference to, and then for the documentation, some of those things like noise and odors can be documented in a diary. Trespassing, you might want to have multiple witnesses, including just for comfort level. Photo and video documentation of things like cleared trees or equipment that's been left abandoned inappropriately. And then reporting, maybe local police, local, state, federal elected officials, state agencies, FERC. So if we want to talk specifically about pre and post testing is something that's come up a lot. My first suggestion, I'm not a lawyer myself. I have some limited role in testing. I would say get a lawyer, because I'm assuming a lot of why we would want to do this testing is to submit evidence in court. And if that's the case, you really should have upfront advice from a lawyer about what can be admissible in court. And I'll talk about that next, why that's important. And the other thing is think about all these things: air, water, soil, noise, health. These are all important, and they could all be impacted. So I don't want to, during this talk, we're pretty much out of time, and I don't want to dictate what I think should be done, but I want to bring up some considerations. Cost, are we going to spend hundreds or tens of thousands? Because the consumer devices that cost hundreds I don't think are going to be provide admissible data in a court of law because they're not approved by the EPA. Operating requirements, the expensive ones that are approved by the EPA are very technical, require expertise. Do they meet technical standards, including for like noise meters? When, where, how long are you going to measure? What pollutants are you going to measure? There are a lot of things to think about. I did put up a link to a presentation that was given at the end of January in Massachusetts by this group, Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. This is their forte. They are very interested in protecting community health and do great work with that. They don't work on like a legal court regulation kind of side of things so much. So if you watch that, just know that they may give one emphasis on things like consumer level particulate matter monitors, which might give you good information but may not stand up in a court of law. And then I also have to point out all these other things we can do. Renewable energy, we have to push that. The lower left panel, we have to divest from our, both our individual holdings, and if we're part of any kind of pension, retirement pension funds, we have to divest those from fossil fuel companies. We have to be out on the streets. We have to be coming here. We have to be organizing and letting our voices be heard and let people know we don't agree with these projects, assuming that's the case. And speaking with our elected officials. These are all important, and I'd like to thank these organizations for supporting the event today. like to specifically thank our New Hampshire elected officials for coming and being involved in your concern and your time, and everyone for staying through. I went over time a bit, but hopefully you learned a lot, and we can have a little time for discussion before going into the workshops. Thank you very much. Oh, no. While we go through any conversation time we have left, I'll just put up a picture of a compressor station in Minnesota from September of this year.
I believe we have some questions. Pat? Oh, here's a microphone coming for you, Pat.
Thanks. This is the first I heard that Drake is going to be an electric compressor station. Did you know that, Jim? No. Why did Kinder Morgan decide to do that? Because all your points are well taken, but for the people of New Ipswich who would be living right next to in our Temple Elementary School, less than half a mile from a compressor station, why would they do it in Drake and not do it here? Thank you.
Yeah, I did ask that question. Somebody emailed me a great answer. I can only give a partial answer, and so I think Anna can do a great job answering that.
Well, it just came to our attention last week that the power companies have submitted an application to the DPU to upgrade the power lines that the pipeline is going to be running through. They're actually going to be bringing in a 3-phase line. They denied that it was for the compressor station. However, what we're seeing is an indicator that it's specifically for that reason. They're calling it a reliability issue, that they need the upgrades for reliability, and we see it as just it's the means to power up the compressor station.
Yeah, no, it would be better, but you wouldn't love it.
Yeah.
The other thing
No, we're still concerned over the blowdowns and the pollutants and all of that.
So some of the other considerations are the availability of a high tension power system, the population density around the site, and the other conditions like altitude and weather. And was it Rob? Somebody emailed me an even better answer, but those are a lot of the things that factor into it. So it could be that elevation is a concern at other ports of the pipeline, for example. Well, now go back. Yeah, this brings me back to the Kinder Morgan's concern for what do they consider concerning for population.
Question?
I'd like to bring up something that seems like subsequent to what is being discussed. I'm thinking about a law called Murphy's Law. If it can go wrong, it will. The worst possible time, worst possible situation, so on. Here's my question. In the history of Kinder Morgan, they've caused death. How have they handled payment for the deaths of the lives that they've taken? How have they handled payments for the lives that they have ruined through injury, through disability? Have they? Is this information available? If it is, I would respectfully request that Kinder Morgan be forced to put this information out as well as their, oh, you're going to get so much tax money out of this. I would really like to have that information. Thank you.
One thing that I'll tell you is that we will not have all the answers to these things. However, if you notice on the wall, there's something called a parking lot, and when you're in your breakout groups, there are parking lots for just those sorts of questions where we may not have the answers here, but we don't want to lose those questions. So Dr. Nordgaard may have a thought, but I'd also like to make sure that that question gets written up there. So could one of our volunteers grab the marker nearby and make sure that question gets written, please? And also, Jim, you have a... I see there's a hand right there. There's a mic coming to you.
I know a lot about this 2 years ago, and I decided to watch
There's a
the
mic for you.
Minnesink. Oh, I watched the video from Minnesink, New York. It was long and lengthy. I never finished it, and people actually talked about what it was to have this thing put in their community. I actually went and also watched the frack gas, the old movie, thinking it was like, going to be way over my head and whatever. I am a chemist. And it just talked about how this affected people's lives and what it was like to live there. This affects everybody, but what I got out of one of the movies was gas companies are above the law. So if you think like normal people that how do they get, sue, and pay, they have not broken the law. So when you're asking what has happened, they don't have to go by a lot of the requirements that normal companies go through between noise laws and pollution laws and all these other laws that normal companies go through. They are above a lot of the laws. The laws are not all, they don't really have to deal with some of these maximums and minimums and whatever, they're above the law. So we don't think like them. So when you're asking what they've paid and not paid, if you even watch some of these videos online about people that live near some of these stations, you'll see what people live there because they can't go live anywhere else and they just don't know what to do. They can't grow food. They can't have animals. Mike's going. The debris, the particulates, whatever that are in the atmosphere, the lead, their wells are contaminated. And it's not just people that are sitting near the compression stations. This goes on for miles. The noise is incredible if you listen to some of these movies.
Thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate it. I see another question here. I'm sorry to move you on a bit. Oh, and the mic, it's coming to you. Thank you for trying to go to the mic, though.
Mic, anyway. I'll stand at the back. My name is Sam Thomas. I'm a resident here of Pelham, and I've worked in the pipeline industry for about 46 years. I've retired from Tyco International. In my field of expertise, I'm what they call a subject matter expert. And I think that what you put up there was all perfectly good information. Some clarification I'm not going to do today. But I think that if I can be humble here, I think we're all looking at the wrong problem. The problem with the compressor stations are totally correct. But your bigger risk is you got a 36-inch or 30 or 48 or 56-inch pipeline going down a right-of-way, what they call a right-of-way, that's where you lay the pipeline. And what happens if the coating isn't properly protected, the pipe is not properly protected with a nitrocatic coating, and they put electricity to the pipe to protect the pipe from corrosion. If you've ever seen a pipeline that has a pinhole and it ruptures at 1,300, 2,000, 300,000, 3,000 PSI, I have been. I've worked in Russia, the Middle East, all over the world, involved in pipeline construction, oil and gas, onshore and offshore. And what happens to a pipeline, I've seen it in Russia with Gazprom, on a 56-inch pipeline, 1-inch wall steel, pilots can see it at 25,000 feet because essentially it's a bomb going off. So my concern to you is you're concerned about the health benefits, and again, I can be the bad guy here, I can be the good guy. What we should be concerned about, yes, what's going on at these compressor stations is correct. Nothing you've said is incorrect. What I think the group should be concerned about is the pipeline itself. And the very logical question is, why aren't they putting it in the right-of-way where you have the electrical corridor? And there's a very simple answer. Because when you put that pipeline in the right-of-way, the current on the high voltage lines come down to ground, it follows the tower down, it goes into the ground, and it jumps under the steel pipeline. It follows down the steel pipeline. At some point, it decides to jump off. It jumps off, and it blows the coating off the pipe. Guess what? That is a source for corrosion. And things like stress corrosion cracking, these are all issues. So again, all I'm trying to do is to say, I think you got to look at the much bigger picture, which is your pipeline itself.
Thank you so much for your comment, and I'm going to ask, oh, go ahead.
Would prove part of his point. This is what a 30-inch pipe would look like. This is.
That's why I'm going to
You don't
ask.
think about 30 inches. You don't think about the size of what it really is. And it could be increased another 6 inches.
And that's actually, in the gas industry, that is a small pipeline.
I'm
And
going
gas
to
pipelines,
ask,
like you'll see, the transmission lines in Canada, in Russia particularly, and Middle East, they're all 56-inch high pressure. And this is, to that, there is 1 inch typically of wall thickness. So you're dealing with a 30, if this is a 30, you'll be really dealing with a 34-inch diameter pipe, or 32-inch if it's 1 inch of wall steel. And the type of steel you use, and the diameter of the pipe. And by the way, this pipe is not straight, guys. Ladies, excuse me. This pipeline doesn't go straight. It goes straight, but when you come to a hill, you got to go over the hill, you got to come down the hill, and you have to bend this pipe. So this pipe is like a big conduit tube, and it's under tremendous pressure. And my concern as a citizen of Pelham, and being what we call a subject matter expert in the industry, I'd be more concerned about that bloody pipeline and where you're putting it, and how you're going to protect it, and how you're going to provide monitoring to ensure that pipeline has integrity is more important to me personally, than your compressor stations, because you got a bigger problem potentially if it ever explodes. And
one
those
of the things that,
are absolutely correct. I've seen it in Russia. I've seen it in the Middle East where these pipelines explode because they're not properly protected, monitored, and maintained.
this is one of the reasons that we've been offering these conversation forums, is because this pipeline is not a one-issue issue. It is multitudinous. It is a Medusa's head. And therefore, I would like one of our volunteers to run up to this gentleman that we've just met and make sure that we have his name, address, and phone number, because we rely heavily, I've said the right word, I guess, heavily on making sure that we are using the resources in our own community to make sure that everyone can learn about it and stand up. So I thank you so much for your comments, and I'm so glad that you're here, and so glad for Jennifer bringing her visual. I'm going to move us on because we are, I'm a taskmaster here. So one of the things we want to do is to give Dr. Nordgaard a huge round of applause and thank him. And as my mother would say, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as every economist and economist knows. So for our volunteers, we're going to start passing a pipe, and we would love for you to give donations for Dr. Nordgaard, because this is not his day job. This is what he does in addition. So while we're doing that, I would like us all, though, to move on. You will get an opportunity to speak to Dr. Nordgaard when we get into our small sessions, if you choose to be in that one. There are some very important things about health, and on your sheet, because we don't want anyone, excuse me, I'm wavering from this microphone, we don't want anyone to leave this building without a job. And your job is, right in your hand, is you can write 4 letters to our elected officials right there. So all you have to do is put your stuff on the back, cut it in 4, put 4 stamps on it, and you have sent it to 4 of our elected officials. I also am going to send around to you similar cards that are addressed to FERC. And the reason that we want these things out there is, and today we're focusing on health, but there are many, many other issues, as this gentleman spoke to us about. But in New Hampshire and other states, we are now looking at trying to get FERC to not just look at environmental impact statements, but also to have FERC develop and implement a comprehensive, and that word is important, health impact statement. So the way we get that to happen is that we make sure that we're telling them we want that to happen. So your 4-up postcard is asking our elected officials. Governor Hassan and our elected officials have already started that letter, and now we want to be behind them saying continue to push for that. And I'm also going to ask our volunteers if they'd be kind enough to come up and grab these cards and distribute these, because these go to FERC. So at the end of the day, you should have 5 jobs done in the mail tomorrow. Now we've got a little chaos going on here. That's okay, a little creative chaos. And once that's finished, I think we're done. We've got 2 more things that we break into groups. Yeah, so we're getting to that next. Okay. Okay, got it. Excellent. We okay? Okay. Mark? Now, in my other life, before I retired, as an environmental educator, when it was time to get folks to gather together, I would sing. So guess what? You guys get to hear me sing. Root, stems, leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. Root, stems, leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. Root, stems, leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. Those are the parts that a plant does need. 1, 2, 3. If everyone would kindly sit down. We're going to move on. I'm a vicious taskmaster, as you can see. There are a couple of things that we need to do before we break into groups. Thank you, you are wonderful. One thing we want to do is I'd like you to introduce Bill McDivitt and Brian McCarthy. Bill McDivitt is one of our town selectmen. Brian is our town administrator, who is also a representative on our New Hampshire Municipal Coalition. Very important organization, made up of all the towns along the pipeline route, and they have been working tirelessly for us. So, if you would come up, Bill, we'd like Bill to talk to you about the warrant. So I'm going to have to ask everyone to be quiet. And if there are folks in the back, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to stop chatting too. I don't have my teacher lips on, but I might, if need be. All righty.
Going to use the microphone, but we'll try it. I'm going to be very, very, very brief. For the Pelham residents, on the town ballot, second Tuesday in March at town meeting, we have Article 11, and I will spare you my reading this to you. Article 11 proposes to raise $49,000 toward the legal fees that will be involved with the multi-community coalition, which I think Brian tells me may run as much as $500,000. What's critical about this warrant article is that you vote and vote yes. Some years ago, the legislature, in their wisdom, and I mean that, passed a law called no means no. And what that means is that if the selectmen propose that we spend money for a specific thing like this $49,000 for the legal fees, and it gets voted down, we can't spend any money for it. So it's very important that you vote yes on Article 11. If you have questions about Article 11 today or any time between now and town meeting, you're certainly welcome to get in touch with me, 635-7642. If I don't recognize a number, I don't always pick it up, particularly after this election season. I'm sure we all went through that. Or you can contact Brian McCarthy at Town Hall, and we'll get you an answer. But the critical thing is get people to come out and vote yes on this warrant article. Talk to your neighbors, talk to friends, get them out. We get terrific apathy for town meeting voting. terrific apathy. Presidential election, primary, oh my goodness gracious, I see hundreds of people I have never seen in my entire life. Town meeting, 20%, 25, maybe 30% of the voters, as opposed to a huge 50, 60% for other meetings. Come out, vote yes on Article 11, and it will help us enormously in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you very much, Bill. And on your chairs, for those of you that are in Pelham, you have colored cards. Share those with your neighbors. That's very important. I'd now also like you to meet, before we break up into groups, I would like you to meet Representative Sean Jasper, who is the head of Speaker of the House, and also Jim McConnell, our representative in spirit for Pelham, from the western part of the state. So please come up and chat with our neighbors. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to give you a little bit of update as to where things are, and Jim will probably go into more detail. As Speaker of the House, I have not taken a position on this pipeline. I continue to gather information and meet with anyone who wants to meet with me. I'm still learning, and this has been a learning experience today, but I represent the House, and at this point the House hasn't really taken a position. So from a legislative standpoint, I'm learning. Some of you know, I'm sure you know Jack Flanagan, who was Majority Leader last year, who did take a position on this, and I applaud him for doing that. We have a couple bills, both of which I support. One having to do with eminent domain. I have always strongly felt that if property is going to be taken for eminent domain and the property owner no longer wishes to own the rest of that property because of whatever is going on, that the entity that's taking the property should be in a position where they have to buy the entire property. I believe that's House Bill 1660 is moving through the process, and I'm very hopeful that the House will pass that and move it on to the Senate. The other is 1101, House Bill 1101, dealing with making sure that if the pipeline is built, those of us who are on natural gas, and I actually am on one property that we own is on Liberty Utilities natural gas. That pipeline was recently put down the road, actually by Continental Paving. They may have wished with oil prices now they didn't spend that money to convert to natural gas, but it ran by my house, and we are hooked up on that, so I'm familiar with that aspect of it. But one thing that shouldn't happen is people should not be forced through any type of a tariff to pay for the cost of this pipeline. If this is a project that is economically viable, there's no reason for them to pass through any cost to existing customers. That should be something that they should have to show is warranted by the additional customers that they'd have. I will just say that I am very concerned about the effects that this pipeline will have. This is not something that I take lightly, so I am going to continue to look at this. I'm going to continue to rely on the experts in the House who are studying this, such as Jim, and we will do what we can, but I think, as most of you know, much of this is in the hands of FERC, which we have very little control over, and I'm sure you're finding out, as I know, that the federal government tends not to be terribly responsive to anybody. So it is a very frustrating process dealing with any of these agencies. It's a terrible, the bureaucracies that have been created in Washington certainly don't seem to serve the people of the United States. And that is a problem, and I think that's part of the anger we're seeing in this country as we watch this rather remarkable election season. I'll be around for a while, so if you have any questions, we'll certainly try to answer them for you. Thank you.
First off, my name is Jim McConnell, as some of you know, and I am a pipeline opponent. I am state representative. I represent Cheshire 12, which is the towns of Richmond and Swansea out in Cheshire County. First off, let me say it's a real pleasure to follow another elected official, because I rarely wind up doing that. Dave Wheeler comes out solidly against this. Periodically, I see Kevin Avard and I see Andy Sanborn over in the western part of the state. And other than that, the only one who speaks before me, it seems, is Jack Flanagan. So I am very glad to see Sean here. Great to see you. In any event, as you're aware, we came up with 11 bills, 11 pipeline bills. As Sean's pointed out, there are 2 that are still out there that are very important. I could start with 1660. There was a hearing the other day, which I'm told went very well. I was down the hall working on another bill. But nonetheless, that's the eminent domain bill, and we'll see what happens there. Last year, the House passed a similar bill, expanded on it some this year. Jim Belanger is the sponsor on that one. He was the sponsor on the one last year. We got it through the House, and it died in the Senate. Hopefully we can prevent that this year. But I'm told that went very well. And the other bill, and the one that I'm particularly keen on, is 1101, which prohibits ratepayers, electric ratepayers, from paying for the construction of a natural gas pipeline. My contention is, and I've probably explained this ad nauseum, so forgive me if you've heard it before. My contention is that, particularly in light of Kinder Morgan's recent financial difficulties, that if they have to go and make their case that, in fact, this pipeline is viable, that they might run into more trouble than you would offhand think. The beginning of December 1st, Moody's reduced the outlook on Kinder Morgan from stable to no, not junk. It's not quite junk. Anyway, they downgraded it slightly in sense of their outlook to guarded or something. But in any event, the stock dropped 30% inside a week, and they cut their dividend by 3/4. That applied to $44 billion in debt. This project is estimated, and it might be a lowball estimate, at $5.2 billion. If they have to go to the oil and gas department at Citibank or Goldman Sachs or John Hancock to make that case, they're going to have their act together. Right now, they haven't, after 2 years of trying, been able to fill any more than 50% of this pipeline. It's an export pipeline, and that's going to make it dependent on what happens overseas. Right now, there's another pipeline being constructed in Pennsylvania called Mariner 2, and that goes from the fracking fields straight to an export facility in the southern part of the state of Pennsylvania, south of Philadelphia. If I were an exporter, I'd want to ship on that one. And there's a court case that makes it less valuable for them to ship through Canada and allows them to ship directly coming up here. That's just been decided, that is beginning to have an impact. Long and the short of it is, it's very important to continue to delay and fight this in every way we can. And while I want to digress slightly from the bills, just to make a point that I make at every one of these hearings that I attend, in my opinion, the scoping sessions that were held this summer never should have been held. Now, I blame FERC for that, but more than FERC, I blame our governor, I blame our 2 senators, and I blame our representatives in Congress, because if any one of them, as far as I'm concerned, had as much as cleared their throat, that might have been substantially delayed. And the reason it should have been delayed is because Kinder Morgan sent to each of the towns involved in their proposed pipeline's path maps and everything else that had TBDs all over it. And you can't very well assess the damage and the environmental impact with it to be determined for a route. 10 days after the scoping sessions were announced, Kinder Morgan had the arrogance to drop a 6,500-page change to what they'd already submitted. And that tells me, quite frankly, that they're extremely comfortable with the regulatory agencies that are supervising them, if you can even say that, and the elected officials who are in a position to do something about it, none of whom have said a thing. Now, 51 weeks into this, Ann Custard did come out, Congresswoman Custard did come out against the pipeline, and I'd contend that at least part of the reason for that is that Jack Flanagan has indicated an interest in running for Congress and seeks to make this an issue. Interestingly enough, on that very same day, Kelly Ayotte decided to come out against it when she arranged for Jack Flanagan to call her and ask about it. Fine. But I'm very interested in seeing them actually do something about it. Otherwise, I'm sorry, but to my way of thinking, that is simply an exercise in trying to have your cake and eat it too. The governor has been against us on this throughout, and she's made that clear to a number of people who've spoken to her about it. And as far as Senator Shaheen goes, she's completely missing in action. She hasn't said boo. So I never want to fail to miss an opportunity to lay the blame where it belongs. In any event, let me get back to the bills. A number of these bills were heard before the Science and Technology and Energy Committee. Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. 1140 was a financial responsibility bill, which would have required third-party insurance and to not only construct the pipeline, but also to ensure that in the event of an accident that they would have coverage to ensure that that was taken care of. ST&E defeated that 15-6. 1146 was a certificate of site and facility measure. That would have changed the word may to shall in 2 cases. That was defeated 15-5. 1148, relative to pipeline capacity contracts, which would require that the Public Utility Commission consider the public good or public interest on all contracts greater than 1 year. That was defeated 11-10. I'll be taking that to the floor, and just for the speaker's information, I'll be looking for a roll call vote on that, and we'll see if we can get that passed. Let's see, the next bill. 1149, that was put in at the behest of Richard Canoff, the attorney for the New Hampshire Pipeline Awareness Network, and that would have required a 12.5% royalty on exported gas. And I don't have the count on that, but they defeated that pretty close to unanimously. House Bill 1174, related to energy sources for new natural gas transmission compressor stations, was defeated 14-7. That would have fixed it so that the 41,000 horsepower compressor station in New Ipswich would have been electric powered as opposed to natural gas powered. And as I say, that was defeated 14-7. House Bill 1472, relative to the siting of certain new pipelines and storage vessels, was defeated 17-1. That was a bill that would have required that all of the pipeline be put below the frost line. I don't know how it is here in Pelham, but over where I am, every spring, you drive down a road and it bounces all over the place. And I have to believe that that's going to be a problem with the pipeline. I mean, the Kinder Morgan people, when we have any of these bills, come in and testify against them, and they bring whatever experts they think they need. And they were able to convince the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee that not only did FERC preempt just about all of this, but also that, so it would be a waste of time to do anything, probably wind us up, would probably wind up in court and get nowhere. But in any event, they also brought in engineers who indicated that, well, they've got 50 years or something experience here in New England with pipelines. They've never put anything below the frost line. They have to have 3 feet of cover, and that's proven more than adequate. Nobody was able to present any evidence of any major failures here in New England, and basically that carried the day on that. Now, which of those bills beyond 1148 I'm going to choose to attempt to do something with on the floor, I don't know, but certainly 1148. Now, 1101, in the event that that doesn't come out of committee in the event that that comes out of committee inexpedient to legislate, or even if it comes out recommended that we pass and we debate it on the floor, which we will unless it comes out and goes on the consent calendar, and I know there is a division within the committee, so that won't happen. That will be debated on the floor, and again, I'll want a roll call vote on that. Doing everything we can on these things. Bottom line is, it's been extremely difficult, and Kinder Morgan continues to show up and oppose everything. I was flattered that at another bill that I didn't think had anything to do with pipelines, the Kinder Morgan people showed up to hear my testimony anyway. So I guess they've sort of figured out, this guy's a problem. We might as well just hang around and see what he does. But in any event, I thought that was interesting. Anyway, let me touch on the rest of these bills. 1533, relative to noise level limitations for permanent machinery. Now, this was an effort to fix it so that in New Ipswich, at least, we would have a situation where they might have to consider enclosing the compressor station, which they have done in some urban areas. This got completely clobbered. When I showed up there, not only were the Kinder Morgan people there to oppose me, but also the forestry people, the construction people, the gravel people, and it went on and on. And finally, I was advised by one of the lobbyists, or advised the committee, that, in fact, we've already got a law about this. And they do, and it allows the towns to take care of this. Nobody at any way in the process, however, or any of the other co-sponsors knew about that. So basically, I asked them to just put that away, and that's not something we're going to hear any more about, because that was certainly headed for complete and total and embarrassing defeat. We had another bill, 1109, which I don't know the standing of at this point relative to, although I'm not optimistic about it, which would require the payment of reasonable attorney's fees in the event that it's determined that a property is undervalued by 20%. 1544 was establishing a tax on revenues from natural gas transmission. That has been defeated. I don't have the numbers on those. 1174, relative to energy sources for new oh, well, I've already discussed that one. And 1660, which Sean mentioned, which is, in fact, the eminent domain bill, which we're fairly optimistic about. So at this point, the real action is 1101 and 1660. 1101 is the one about paying for it, and 1660 is the eminent domain bill. And that's, at this point, pretty well where we stand. You can rest assured that I will continue to be active in this, and even after we're done with these bills, I intend to say anything and everything I can at any and every opportunity about this subject. As far as I'm concerned, it took me about 3 minutes to figure out this pipeline was a really rotten idea, and the idea that the governor, our 2 senators, and our 2 representatives in Congress can't pull their heads out of their butts and get the message the same as I did is, to me, appalling. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you so much. One of the things that I saw as the bills were unfolding was they may not all be passing, but one of the things that it certainly did was it started a conversation much more on a statewide level, and we need to keep that conversation going. So we need to thank again Representative McConnell and all the other representatives who have been working so hard on these situations for us. So again, thank you very, very much. I used to work for 4-H Youth Development, and we used to call what we did being on 4-H time. Well, we're on 4-H time. It's all cool. We're good. What I'd like to do is I would like to call on Mr. Dilberger to come up, please, for just a second, because he did have something that he wanted to let you folks know about, which is an exciting project.
Brief announcement. I'm Bob Dilberger from Mason, New Hampshire. I'm here as a representative of our citizens group
I used to be as tall as he was.
See, this is what the pipeline has done to you, right?
That's right.
I'm starting to feel this way myself. Anyway, I just wanted to take a brief moment to let you know about a project that the Mason Pipeline Committee is working on. We're going to be announcing soon, hopefully this week, a contest to solicit videos to espouse our opponent's point of view to help counter some of the public relations stuff that Kinder Morgan and Eversource and other folks have been putting out. The thing that makes it particularly interesting is we have an anonymous donor in Mason who's put up $10,000 for prize money. So there's a lot of cash on the line here. We're going to be notifying all the local universities that have media programs, but anybody's invited to attend. We're looking for videos of 2 minutes or less. And when you get the announcement, you'll see it announced on Facebook and all the usual pipeline places. We've identified half a dozen key points that we'd like to have the videos focus on. So I just wanted to bring that up to let you folks know that this is coming. So when you do see the emails coming around or whatever it is, take a few minutes to look and spread the word, because I think it could potentially be an exciting outcome. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. One thing that you should know about is that we in Pelham are continuing to look for volunteers, and there's a lime green sheet over there that talks about the kind of work that we do and the things that we're looking for. So we would love for you to grab one of those sheets and join us. The other thing is I'd like you to meet Caroline Sellers, if you wouldn't mind standing up just for a second. Caroline is from Townsend, Mass. I always get the Mass, those out there are a little confused. But Caroline is very involved in affected homeowner issues and will be attending the session that Joe McGuire from Mason will be holding on affected landowner information, because she and her colleagues on our behalf as well are developing a survey looking at affected landowners and how to better serve them. So keep an eye and meet Caroline if you have a chance. Okay, now for a little bit of our next creative chaos, and that is we'd like you to go to your workshop sessions. And the way that works is that your agenda has your workshop sessions listed with a little description. We have hosts and we have facilitators, so would our hosts and facilitators please take their stations. You will see a large poster with the name of the session on it. Give them a section. And then when they're ready, I will count to 3, and you will go to the session that you would like to go to. I see 3 sessions up. There should be a 4th one. There it is. Okay, there it is, Pipeline 101. And affected landowner is there.